During a quiet afternoon stroll, Dr. Lawson discovers a black baby abandoned in a trash can and rescues her without hesitation. Years later, a devastating call threatens to unravel everything they've built. As buried secrets come to light, how far will he go to protect the family he's fought so hard to create? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dr. James Lawson sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the framed photo of him and Margaret on their wedding day. Their smiles were bright, full of hope for the future they'd dreamed of together. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. The years had been kind to them in many ways, but the one thing they wanted most had remained out of reach. "James?" Margaret's soft voice came from the doorway. "Are you ready to call it a day?" He looked up, meeting his wife's warm gaze. Margaret's face was as beautiful as ever, though he could see the same sadness in her eyes that he felt in his heart. "Just finishing up some paperwork," he replied, forcing a smile. Margaret stepped into the room, her presence bringing a comforting warmth. "You work too hard, dear," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Dr. Lawson covered her hand with his own, feeling the familiar softness of her skin. "I know," he admitted. "It's just—" "I understand," Margaret said, her voice filled with empathy. She knew all too well why he threw himself into his work. As a pediatrician, James could pour his nurturing instincts into caring for other people's children, even if they couldn't have their own. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared grief hanging in the air between them. Then Margaret squeezed his shoulder and said, "Why don't we go for a walk in the park?" "It's a beautiful evening." James nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Their evening walks had become a cherished tradition over the years, a way to connect and find moments of peace amidst their disappointment. As they strolled hand in hand through the park, the setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. Children laughed and played on the nearby playground, their joyful sounds a bittersweet reminder of what James and Margaret had longed for. "Do you ever wonder what our life would be like if things had been different?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James squeezed her hand. "All the time," he admitted. "But then I remember how lucky I am to have you." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked. "I feel the same way," she said. "I just wish—" "I know, love," James replied, his heart aching. "I know." They continued their walk in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The park had always been a place of solace for them, a quiet refuge where they could simply be together without the need for words. As they rounded a bend in the path, the playground came into view once more. A young couple pushed their toddler on the swings, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. James felt Margaret tense beside him, and he instinctively pulled her closer. "It's okay," he murmured, though he felt the familiar pang of longing in his own chest. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm all right," she said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "Let's finish our walk." As they continued on, James marveled at his wife's strength. Despite the heartache they'd endured, Margaret's capacity for love and nurturing seemed endless. He wished, not for the first time, that he could give her the child she so desperately wanted. The sun dipped below the horizon as they made their way home, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. Their house stood quiet and still, a reminder of the family they'd hoped to fill it with. But as James looked at Margaret, he was reminded that they were a family, just the two of them. Different from what they'd imagined, perhaps, but no less real or valuable. "Thank you for suggesting the walk," James said as they reached their front door. "I needed that." Margaret smiled up at him, her love shining in her eyes. "Me too," she replied. "We'll be okay, James, as long as we have each other." He nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. As they stood there on their porch, holding each other close, James felt a flicker of hope in his heart. Maybe their story wasn't over yet. Maybe there were still chapters to be written, surprises waiting just around the corner. As Dr. Lawson and Margaret continued their afternoon stroll through the park, a faint sound caught their attention. At first, They weren't sure what it was. "James, do you hear that?" Margaret asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Dr. Lawson paused, tilting his head to listen. "It sounds like a baby crying?" They looked around, puzzled. The playground was empty now, the families having gone home for dinner. The crying grew louder as they walked, leading them towards a row of trash cans near the park's edge. Margaret's eyes widened in horror as they approached. "Oh my God, James, it's coming from there!" Dr. Lawson rushed forward, his heart pounding. He peered into one of the cans and gasped. There, wrapped in dirty rags, was a tiny newborn baby girl. Her dark skin was tinged blue from the cold, her cries weak but desperate. "No," Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes. "How could anyone do this?" Without hesitation, Dr. Lawson reached in and gently lifted the baby into his arms. His doctor's instincts took over, pushing aside his shock and disbelief. "She's freezing," he said, cradling the infant close to his chest. "We need to get her to the hospital right away." Margaret nodded, her face pale with worry. "I'll call an ambulance." "No time," Dr. Lawson said, already starting to jog towards the park exit. "The hospital's only a few blocks away. We'll be faster on foot." They hurried through the darkening streets, the baby's cries growing weaker. Margaret ran alongside her husband, her eyes never leaving the tiny bundle in his arms. "Hold on, little one," Dr. Lawson murmured, his professional calm masking the turmoil of emotions beneath. "We're going to take care of you." As they neared the hospital, Margaret sprinted ahead to alert the emergency room staff. Dr. Lawson followed close behind, his focus entirely on the precious life in his arms. Dr. Lawson burst through the emergency room doors, the tiny bundle cradled protectively against his chest. "I need help here," he called out, his voice firm and urgent. The staff sprang into action, recognizing the seriousness in Dr. Lawson's tone. A nurse quickly approached with a warming blanket and took the baby from his arms. "Found abandoned in the park," Dr. Lawson explained as they rushed to an examination room. "Newborn, female, severely hypothermic." For the next few hours, Dr. Lawson worked tirelessly alongside his colleagues to stabilize the infant. Margaret stayed close by, her eyes never leaving the tiny form fighting for life. "Come on, little one," Dr. Lawson murmured as he worked. "You can do this." Slowly but surely, the baby's condition began to improve. Her skin turned from blue to a healthy brown, and her cries grew stronger. As dawn broke, Dr. Lawson stepped back from the incubator, exhaustion etched on his face. He turned to Margaret, who had dozed off in a chair nearby. "Margaret," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "She's stable now." Margaret's eyes fluttered open, immediately filling with concern. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Lawson nodded, a small smile on his lips. "She's a fighter. I think she'll pull through." Margaret stood, moving to the incubator. She placed a gentle hand on the clear plastic, her eyes brimming with tears. "She needs a name," she whispered. Dr. Lawson wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. "How about Hope?" he suggested. "Because that's what she's given us." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As the day wore on, hospital staff and authorities were notified about Hope's situation. Questions arose about her background and her biological parents, but answers were scarce. Dr. Lawson and Margaret found themselves spending every free moment by Hope's side. They watched as she grew stronger, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way her face scrunched up when she yawned. "What's going to happen to her?" Margaret asked one evening, gently stroking Hope's cheek. Dr. Lawson sighed, his brow furrowed with concern. "If they can't find her parents, she'll probably go into foster care." The thought sent a pang through both their hearts. They'd grown so attached to Hope in such a short time. The idea of her being sent away to strangers felt wrong. "James," Margaret said softly, her eyes never leaving Hope's face. What if we took her?" Dr. Lawson looked at his wife, surprise and a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You mean, adopt her?" Margaret nodded, finally turning to meet his gaze. I know it's crazy, but I feel like she was meant for us. Don't you feel it too? Dr. Lawson hesitated, his rational mind warring with the emotions that had been growing in his heart. He looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her incubator, and felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. It won't be easy, he said slowly. There will be a lot of hurdles to overcome. Margaret reached out and took his hand. But she's worth it, isn't she? Dr. Lawson squeezed her hand, a smile spreading across his face. Yes, he said softly. Yes, she is. As the days turned into weeks, Hope grew stronger under the loving care of Dr. Lawson and Margaret. The hospital became a second home to the couple as they spent every spare moment by Hope's side. Meanwhile, the authorities launched an investigation into Hope's abandonment. Detective Sarah Miller, assigned to the case, visited the hospital regularly to update Dr. Lawson and Margaret. We've put out notices, checked local shelters, and interviewed people in the area, she explained one afternoon. But so far, no one has come forward. Margaret's heart ached at the news. She looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her arms. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Miller sighed. If no family claims her within the next few days, she'll likely be placed into foster care. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She tightened her hold on Hope, tears welling in her eyes. Dr. Lawson placed a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder, but his own face was etched with concern. That night, as they sat in the quiet of Hope's hospital room, Margaret turned to her husband. James, she said softly, we can't let her go into foster care. We just can't. Dr. Lawson looked at his wife, seeing the pain and desperation in her eyes. What are you suggesting, Margaret? Let's take her in, Margaret pleaded. Even if it's just temporary, we can give her a loving home while they keep searching for her family. Dr. Lawson's brow furrowed. He glanced at Hope, then back at Margaret. It's not that simple, he said gently. There are a lot of complications to consider. Like what? Margaret asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Dr. Lawson sighed, running a hand through his hair. For one, we're white and she's black. People might judge us, question our motives. It could be hard for her, growing up in a family that doesn't look like her. Margaret shook her head. Love doesn't see color, James. We can give her a good home, teach her about her heritage. It's not just that, Dr. Lawson continued. There's paperwork, legal issues. We'd need to be approved as foster parents. And what if her biological family shows up later? We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Margaret insisted. She reached out and took her husband's hand. James, look at her. Can you honestly say you're ready to let her go? Dr. Lawson looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her crib. He felt a lump form in his throat as he imagined her being taken away, placed with strangers. The thought of never seeing her again made his chest tighten. You're right, he said softly. I'm not ready to let her go. Margaret's eyes lit up with hope. So, we'll do it? We'll take her in? Dr. Lawson nodded slowly. Yes, he said, a small smile forming on his lips. Yes, we'll take her in. We'll figure out the details as we go. Margaret threw her arms around her husband, tears of joy streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, James. As Dr. Lawson and Margaret stepped into their home with Hope nestled safely in Margaret's arms, a sense of nervous excitement filled the air. The quiet house that had once echoed their loneliness now buzzed with new life. Welcome home, Hope, Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Lawson set down the diaper bag and looked around their living room. It seemed different now, as if Hope's presence had already begun to transform their space. We should probably set up the bassinet in our room for now, he said, his practical nature kicking in. Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving Hope's face. Could you do that, James? I don't want to put her down just yet. As Dr. Lawson busied himself with preparing their room, Margaret sat on the couch, gently rocking Hope. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and Margaret felt her heart melt. "Oh, James," she called out. "Come quick, she's awake." Dr. Lawson hurried back, a soft smile spreading across his face as he saw Hope's big brown eyes looking up at them. He sat down next to Margaret, reaching out to touch Hope's tiny hand. "She's beautiful," he murmured. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustments. The once quiet nights were now punctuated by Hope's cries. Margaret would spring out of bed at the slightest sound, eager to comfort their new daughter. Dr. Lawson, though more reserved in his affection, found himself drawn to Hope's crib in the early morning hours. He'd stand there watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle that had come into their lives. One evening, as Margaret prepared a bottle in the kitchen, Dr. Lawson sat in the living room with Hope cradled in his arms. She fussed a little, her face scrunching up in discomfort. "Shh, it's okay," he soothed, gently bouncing her. "Daddy's here." The words slipped out naturally, and Dr. Lawson felt a warmth spread through his chest. He looked down at Hope, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and felt a surge of love so strong it nearly took his breath away. Margaret walked in, bottle in hand, and paused at the sight. Her eyes filled with happy tears as she watched her husband bond with their daughter. "Oh, James," she said softly. He looked up, a tender smile on his face. "I think I'm in love, Margaret," he admitted. Margaret sat down beside them, leaning her head on Dr. Lawson's shoulder as she gazed at Hope. "Me too," she whispered. "More than I ever thought possible." As the days passed, their once quiet house filled with the sounds of Hope's coos and giggles. Lullabies replaced the silence that had haunted them for so long. Margaret's laughter rang out more frequently, and even Dr. Lawson found himself humming as he went about his day. Their lives, once marked by an aching void, now overflowed with purpose and joy. Every diaper change, every late-night feeding, every tiny milestone became a celebration of the family they had become. As the Lawsons settled into their new routine with Hope, life seemed to take on a rosy glow. The house, once filled with silence, now echoed with the joyful sounds of a happy baby. Dr. Lawson found himself rushing home from work each day, eager to see Hope's toothless grin. Margaret's days were busy with feedings, diaper changes, and endless cuddles. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret sang softly to Hope in the living room, Dr. Lawson went to check the mail. Among the usual bills and medical journals, he found a plain white envelope with no return address. Curious, he opened it right there on the porch. As his eyes scanned the letter inside, his face grew pale. His hands began to shake, and he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The words on the page seemed to blur together, but their meaning was clear. Hope was in danger. "Margaret," he called out, his voice trembling slightly as he stepped back into the house. "We need to talk." Margaret looked up from where she sat with Hope, her smile fading as she saw the worry etched on her husband's face. "What is it, James? What's wrong?" Dr. Lawson sank into the armchair across from them, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. It's about Hope," he said softly. Margaret instinctively held the baby closer. "What about Hope?" With a deep breath, Dr. Lawson began to explain. "This letter, it says that Hope's abandonment wasn't random. It hints at some kind of dark past involving her biological parents. And..." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It suggests they might come looking for her." Margaret's eyes widened in fear, then narrowed with determination. "No," she said firmly. "No one is taking our daughter away from us." Dr. Lawson ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "But Margaret, what if we've put ourselves in danger? What if we've made the wrong choice?" Margaret stood up, cradling Hope protectively against her chest. "James Lawson, don't you dare say that. This little girl needs us. We're her parents now, and we will protect her no matter what." As if sensing the tension in the room, Hope began to fuss. Margaret bounced her gently, making soothing sounds. Dr. Lawson watched them, his heart torn between love for his new family and fear of the unknown threat. "What should we do?" he asked softly. Margaret's voice was steel when she replied, "We fight. We do whatever it takes to keep our daughter safe." Dr. Lawson paced the living room, his brow furrowed with worry. The letter lay on the coffee table, its ominous message weighing heavily on both their minds. Margaret sat on the couch, hope nestled in her arms, her eyes never leaving the baby's peaceful face. "We need to think this through carefully," Dr. Lawson said, his voice low and strained. "This letter, it changes everything." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "It doesn't change how we feel about hope," she said firmly. Dr. Lawson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Of course not, but it does make our situation more complicated. We don't know what kind of danger might be lurking out there." "All the more reason to protect her," Margaret countered. "We should move forward with the adoption, James. Make it official." Dr. Lawson paused in his pacing, turning to face his wife. "I don't know, Margaret. What if more information comes to light? What if her biological parents come forward?" Margaret's arms tightened around Hope. "Then we'll deal with it. But right now, this little girl needs us. We're the only family she has." Dr. Lawson sat down heavily in his armchair, his eyes fixed on Hope. "I love her too, Margaret. You know I do. But we have to be smart about this. What if by adopting her, we're putting ourselves in the crosshairs of whatever danger is out there?" Margaret's voice softened. "James, look at her. Really look at her. Can you imagine letting her go now?" Dr. Lawson's gaze shifted to Hope, taking in her tiny fingers, her button nose, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. His heart swelled with love, even as fear gnawed at his insides. "No," he admitted quietly. "I can't imagine it. But I'm scared, Margaret. I'm scared for her. And for us." Margaret reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know, honey. I'm scared too. But we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. Hope needs us, and we need her." Dr. Lawson squeezed her hand, his resolve wavering. Maybe we should wait a little longer. See if any more information comes to light about her background." Margaret shook her head. "Every day we wait is a day Hope doesn't have the security of a permanent family. We can't leave her in limbo, James." As they sat there, locked in their emotional debate, Hope stirred in Margaret's arms. Her tiny hand reached out, grasping Dr. Lawson's finger. He looked down at her, his heart melting at the sight. Despite their fears, Dr. Lawson and Margaret decided to move forward with the adoption process. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but their love for Hope outweighed their concerns. The next morning, Dr. Lawson called their family lawyer, Mr. Ellison. "We want to adopt Hope," he said, his voice firm but tinged with nervousness. "Are you sure about this, James?" Mr. Ellison asked. "It's a big step, especially given the circumstances." Dr. Lawson glanced at Margaret, who was feeding Hope in the kitchen. He nodded, even though the lawyer couldn't see him. "We're sure. This little girl needs us." Over the next few weeks, they dove into the adoption process. There were mountains of paperwork, interviews with social workers, and home visits. Through it all, Dr. Lawson couldn't shake the nagging doubts in the back of his mind. One night, as they sat on the porch after putting Hope to bed, he voiced his concerns to Margaret. "What if we're making a mistake? What if we're putting her in danger by keeping her?" Margaret reached out and took his hand. "James, we're giving her a loving home. That's the safest place for her to be." Dr. Lawson squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty. "You're right. I just can't help worrying." As they progressed through the adoption process, Dr. Lawson threw himself into researching ways to keep Hope safe. He installed a new security system in their home and made sure all the windows and doors were secure. Margaret watched his efforts with a mix of love and concern. "James," she said one day, "we can't live in fear. We have to give Hope a normal life." Dr. Lawson paused in his work, looking at his wife. "I know," he said softly. "I just want to make sure she's protected." Despite his fears, Dr. Lawson couldn't deny the joy Hope brought to their lives. Her giggles filled their once quiet home, and her smile could melt away even his darkest worries. As they tucked her in each night, he found himself falling more in love with the idea of being her father. But the letter still loomed in his mind, a constant reminder of the unknown threats that might be out there. He and Margaret agreed to keep it a secret from the adoption agency, fearing it might jeopardize their chances of keeping Hope. As they took their first steps toward officially becoming Hope's parents, Dr. Lawson and Margaret held on to each other and their love for their little girl. They knew challenges lay ahead, but they were determined to face them together, as a family. 5 years had passed since Hope came into the Lawsons' lives, and their once quiet home now buzzed with the energy of a lively 5-year-old. Hope's laughter echoed through the halls as she chased her stuffed bunny around the living room. "Catch me if you can, Mr. Flopsy," she giggled, her curly pigtails bouncing with each step. Dr. Lawson looked up from his medical journal, a warm smile spreading across his face. He still marveled at how much joy this little girl had brought into their lives. Margaret poked her head out from the kitchen. "Hope, sweetie, it's almost time for dinner. Why don't you help Daddy set the table?" "Okay, Mommy," Hope chirped, skipping over to Dr. Lawson. As they laid out plates and forks together, Dr. Lawson couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. The fears that once plagued him had faded, replaced by the deep love he felt for his daughter. Sure, there had been challenges. They'd faced curious looks and sometimes unkind comments when out in their mostly white neighborhood. But they'd also found unexpected alleys and formed new friendships with families who celebrated their love. At the dinner table, Hope regaled them with tales from her day at kindergarten. "And then Tommy said he wanted to be an astronaut, but I told him I'm going to be a doctor just like Daddy." Margaret squeezed Dr. Lawson's hand under the table, both of them beaming with pride. They'd worked hard to create a home where Hope felt safe, loved, and empowered to dream big. Later that evening, as they tucked Hope into bed, she wrapped her little arms around both their necks. "I love you, Mommy and Daddy," she murmured sleepily. "We love you too, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, kissing her forehead. As they closed Hope's bedroom door, Dr. Lawson pulled Margaret close. "Can you believe how lucky we are?" he said softly. Margaret nodded, her eyes shining with happiness. "She's the best thing that ever happened to us." Dr. Lawson sat in his favorite armchair, watching Hope play with her dolls on the living room floor. The sight of her, so carefree and happy, never failed to warm his heart. He marveled at how much their lives had changed in just 5 short years. Before Hope, their home had been quiet, almost too quiet. Now it was filled with laughter, songs, and the pitter-patter of little feet. Dr. Lawson's work as a pediatrician had taken on new meaning. Every child he treated reminded him of Hope, and he found himself going the extra mile for each patient, just as he would for his own daughter. Margaret had blossomed in her role as a mother. She'd thrown herself into parenthood with a passion that amazed Dr. Lawson. From organizing playdates to volunteering at Hope's preschool, Margaret had found her true calling. "Daddy, look," Hope exclaimed, holding up a crayon drawing. "It's our family." Dr. Lawson leaned forward, examining the colorful scribbles. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Why don't we hang it on the fridge?" As they walked to the kitchen, Dr. Lawson remembered the early days after they'd brought Hope home. There had been challenges, of course. Curious stares and whispered comments when they went out as a family. But for every unkind word, there had been a neighbor bringing over a homemade casserole or a fellow church member offering babysitting help. Slowly but surely, their community had embraced Hope. Mrs. Johnson from next door doted on her like a grandmother. Hope's preschool teacher, Ms. Rivera, had gone out of her way to make sure Hope felt included and celebrated. "James, can you help me with these balloons?" Margaret called from the dining room. They were preparing for Hope's 5th birthday party the next day. As Dr. Lawson tied balloons to chairs, Margaret hung a happy birthday banner. They worked in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of how far they'd come. "Can you believe it's been 5 years?" Margaret said softly, her eyes misty with emotion. Dr. Lawson shook his head, a lump forming in his throat. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday we found her. Other times, I can hardly remember what life was like before her." Margaret nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "She's brought so much joy into our lives. I never knew I could love someone this much." They looked at each other, sharing a moment of deep understanding. The fear and uncertainty that had once clouded their decision to adopt Hope had long since faded, replaced by an unshakable love and commitment to their little girl. "Mommy, Daddy," Hope's voice rang out from the living room. "Can we have ice cream?" Dr. Lawson and Margaret exchanged amused glances. "After dinner, sweetie," Margaret called back. As they finished decorating for the party, Dr. Lawson felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Tomorrow, they would celebrate Hope's 5th birthday, surrounded by friends and family who had come to love her as much as they did. It wasn't just Hope's birthday they were celebrating, but the joy and light she had brought into all their lives. The Lawsons' backyard was a burst of color and joy on the day of Hope's 5th birthday party. Balloons danced in the gentle breeze, streamers hung from trees, and a large banner proclaimed, "Happy 5th Birthday, Hope," in cheerful letters. The air was filled with the sound of children's laughter and the excited chatter of adults. Dr. Lawson stood by the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs, while Margaret bustled about, making sure everyone had drinks and snacks. Hope, wearing a pretty pink dress and a tiara, was the center of attention, her bright smile lighting up the entire gathering. Mrs. Johnson from next door was there, fussing over Hope like a doting grandmother. Hope's preschool teacher, Ms. Rivera, had come too, chatting with other parents and keeping an eye on the children playing games on the lawn. Even Dr. Lawson's colleagues from the hospital had shown up, their own children joining in the fun. As the party reached its peak, Margaret gently guided Hope to the center of the gathering. "Sweetie, would you like to say a few words?" she asked softly. Hope nodded, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She looked around at all the smiling faces and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for coming to my party," she began, her voice clear and sweet. "I'm so happy you're here. And thank you, Mommy and Daddy, for being the best parents ever. You give me lots of hugs and read me stories and make me feel loved every day. I love you so much." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as Hope finished her heartfelt speech. Dr. Lawson and Margaret exchanged glances, their eyes brimming with tears of joy. In that moment, they both realized just how profoundly their lives had changed since Hope had entered their world. Margaret reached out and squeezed Dr. Lawson's hand, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. Dr. Lawson wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They watched as Hope ran off to play with her friends, her laughter ringing out across the yard. The party continued around them, but for a moment Dr. Lawson and Margaret were lost in their own world. They marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from the quiet, unfulfilled couple they once were to the happy, complete family they had become. Hope had filled a void they didn't even know existed, bringing light and love into every corner of their lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the birthday party was winding down. Parents were gathering their children, thanking the Lawsons for a wonderful time. Hope, still wearing her tiara, was hugging her friends goodbye, her face glowing with happiness. Dr. Lawson was helping Margaret clean up, both of them basking in the afterglow of a perfect day. The sound of the house phone ringing inside barely registered at first, lost in the happy chatter around them. "I'll get it," Dr. Lawson called out, giving Margaret a quick peck on the cheek before heading inside. He picked up the phone, still smiling from the day's events. "Hello, Lawson residents," he answered cheerfully. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar and serious. "Dr. Lawson, this is Mark Stevens from the Department of Child Services. I'm afraid I have some news about Hope." Dr. Lawson's smile faded, his heart suddenly racing. "What is it? Is everything all right?" There was a pause before Mr. Stevens continued. "Hope's biological father has come forward. He claims he's been searching for her for years and he's demanding custody." The world seemed to tilt beneath Dr. Lawson's feet. His hand gripped the phone tightly, knuckles turning white. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Dr. Lawson. I know this must be a shock. He's filed a petition with the court. We'll need to set up a meeting to discuss the next steps." Dr. Lawson could barely hear the rest of what Mr. Stevens was saying. His eyes sought out Margaret and Hope through the window. They were laughing together, Hope perched on Margaret's hip, both of them glowing with joy. As he hung up the phone, Dr. Lawson felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He stumbled back outside, his face pale and drawn. Margaret noticed immediately. "James? What's wrong?" she asked, setting Hope down and rushing to his side. Dr. Lawson looked at his wife, then at Hope, who was now watching them with curious eyes. How could he tell them? How could he shatter the perfect world they had built? "Margaret, we need to talk," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Hope, sweetie, why don't you go play with your new toys for a bit?" As Hope skipped off, blissfully unaware, Dr. Lawson led Margaret to a quiet corner of the yard. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "That was child services on the phone," he began, his voice barely audible. "Hope's biological father has come forward. He wants custody." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief and fear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, they can't take her. She's ours, James. She's our daughter." Dr. Lawson pulled Margaret into his arms as she began to sob, his own eyes filling with tears. They clung to each other, their perfect world crumbling around them, as Hope's laughter echoed from inside the house. The days following Hope's birthday party were a blur of anxiety and fear for Dr. Lawson and Margaret. They moved through their daily routines like ghosts, their minds constantly racing with worry about the future. Dr. Lawson spent hours on the phone, reaching out to every lawyer he knew. He pored over adoption laws late into the night, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Margaret, usually the picture of calm, found herself jumping at every phone call, every knock at the door. "We can't lose her, James," Margaret whispered one night, her voice breaking as they lay in bed, both wide awake despite the late hour. "She's our daughter. We're the only parents she's ever known." Dr. Lawson pulled her close, his own heart heavy with fear. "We'll fight this, Margaret, with everything we have. I promise you that." They met with a family law attorney, Mrs. Chen, who specialized in complex adoption cases. Her office was warm and inviting, but her words were sobering. "It's not going to be easy," Mrs. Chen explained gently. "The biological father has rights, and the court will take those into consideration. But you have a strong case too. You've been Hope's parents for 5 years. That counts for a lot." As they left the lawyer's office, Margaret clung to Dr. Lawson's arm. "What if it's not enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Lawson squeezed her hand, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We have to believe it will be, for Hope's sake." At home, they did their best to shield Hope from their worries. They played games, read stories, and went on outings to the park, just as they always had. But there was a new desperation in their actions, a fierce need to cherish every moment. Hope, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, continued to fill their lives with joy. Her laughter echoed through the house, a painful reminder of what they stood to lose. One evening, as Hope was coloring at the kitchen table, she looked up at her parents with her bright, innocent eyes. "Mommy, Daddy, can we go to the zoo this weekend?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Dr. Lawson, seeing his wife's struggle, quickly stepped in. "Of course we can, sweetheart. That sounds like a wonderful idea." As Hope cheered and went back to her coloring, Margaret and Dr. Lawson exchanged a look of mingled love and fear. They knew that every moment with Hope was precious, and they were determined to fight with everything they had to keep their family together. After a few days, the day of the court hearing arrived, casting a somber shadow over the Lawson family. Dr. Lawson and Margaret walked into the courtroom hand in hand, their hearts heavy with worry. Hope was staying with a trusted neighbor, blissfully unaware of the battle being waged over her future. As they took their seats, Dr. Lawson squeezed Margaret's hand, offering silent support. Their eyes locked, conveying a shared determination to fight for their daughter. The judge, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, called the court to order. "We are here today to determine the custody of Hope Lawson," she announced, her voice echoing in the hushed room. Hope's biological father, Marcus Thompson, sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. His face was a mix of determination and sorrow as he glanced at the Lawsons. Marcus's lawyer stood up first. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thompson, is Hope's biological father. He has been searching for his daughter for years, unaware of her whereabouts. He loves her deeply and wants to be a part of her life. It's his right as her natural parent to raise her. Margaret stifled a sob, and Dr. Lawson wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The words cut deep, threatening to unravel the family they had built. Marcus took the stand, his voice trembling with emotion. I never knew about Hope until after she was born. Her mother, she kept it from me. When I found out, I started looking everywhere. I've spent years trying to find my little girl. Please, Your Honor, I just want a chance to be her father. The Lawsons' lawyer, Mrs. Chen, stood up next. Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mr. Thompson's situation, we must consider what's best for Hope. The Lawsons have been her parents for 5 years. They saved her life when she was abandoned as a newborn. They are the only family she has ever known. Dr. Lawson took the stand, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. Hope is our daughter in every way that matters. We've loved her, cared for her, and raised her as our own. She's happy and thriving. Tearing her away from the only home she's ever known would be devastating for her. Margaret testified next, tears streaming down her face. Hope is the light of our lives. We couldn't love her more if she were our biological child. Please don't take our baby away from us. The courtroom was thick with emotion as both sides presented their cases. The judge listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. The Lawsons clung to each other, praying that their love for Hope would be enough to keep their family together. As the day wore on, tensions rose. Marcus's lawyer argued passionately about the importance of biological ties, while Mrs. Chen emphasized the stability and love Hope had always known with the Lawsons. The judge called for a recess, leaving both parties in a state of anxious uncertainty. Dr. Lawson and Margaret huddled together, their faces etched with worry. Across the room, Marcus sat alone, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the decision that would shape his daughter's future. As the court case continued, Mrs. Chen, the Lawsons' lawyer, delved deeper into Marcus Thompson's background. Her investigation began to uncover troubling details about Hope's biological father. Your Honor, Mrs. Chen addressed the court, her voice steady and clear. I'd like to present evidence regarding Mr. Thompson's ability to provide a stable home for Hope. She produced a series of documents, laying them out before the judge. These records show that Mr. Thompson has a history of mental health issues, including multiple hospitalizations for depression and anxiety. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes downcast. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear. Mrs. Chen continued, Furthermore, Mr. Thompson's financial situation is precarious at best. He has been unemployed for extended periods and has a history of evictions due to unpaid rent. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of these revelations settled over everyone present. Dr. Lawson glanced at Margaret, seeing a mix of relief and sadness in her eyes. Margaret's heart felt heavy. She wanted nothing more than to keep Hope safe and secure, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of empathy for Marcus. She imagined how difficult his life must have been, struggling with mental health issues and financial instability. As Mrs. Chen presented more evidence, Margaret found herself torn between conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt a fierce protectiveness towards Hope, wanting to shield her from any potential harm or instability. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the pain etched on Marcus's face as his troubled past was laid bare for all to see. Dr. Lawson noticed Margaret's internal struggle. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently, offering silent support. Margaret gave him a small, grateful smile, drawing strength from his presence. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the new information. She turned to Marcus's lawyer. Do you have any response to these allegations? Marcus's lawyer stood, looking flustered. Your Honor, while my client has faced challenges in the past, he is committed to providing a loving home for his daughter. He has been seeking treatment for his mental health issues and is actively looking for stable employment. As the arguments continued, Margaret found herself wrestling with her conscience. She knew that Hope's well-being had to come first, but she couldn't shake the feeling of compassion for Marcus. She wondered if there might be a way to keep Hope safe while still allowing her biological father some connection to her life. Marcus Thompson took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the witness box. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who claimed to be Hope's biological father. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice wavering with emotion. I know I've made mistakes in my life. I've struggled with depression and anxiety, and I've had trouble keeping a job. But I love my daughter, even though I've never had the chance to know her. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. When I found out about Hope, it was like a light turned on in my life. I've been searching for her for years, never giving up hope that I'd find her someday. Margaret felt her heart constrict as she watched Marcus pour out his feelings. She glanced at Dr. Lawson, seeing the conflict in his eyes that mirrored her own. I'm not perfect, Marcus continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But I want to be better. For Hope, I want the chance to be her father, to watch her grow up, to be there for her first day of school and her first heartbreak. The raw emotion in Marcus's voice touched everyone in the courtroom. Even the judge's stoic expression softened slightly. I know the Lawsons have given Hope a good home, Marcus said, his gaze shifting to where Dr. Lawson and Margaret sat. I'm grateful for that, but she's my flesh and blood. I just want the chance to be part of her life. As Marcus's testimony continued, the full extent of his struggles became clearer. He spoke openly about his battles with mental health, his difficulty maintaining employment, and the financial hardships he'd faced. Dr. Lawson listened intently, his medical training allowing him to understand the depth of Marcus's mental health issues. He felt a mix of sympathy for the man's struggles and concern for Hope's well-being. The prosecuting attorney began her cross-examination, her questions highlighting the instability in Marcus's life. Mr. Thompson, in the past 5 years, how many times have you been hospitalized for your mental health issues? Marcus's shoulders slumped. 3 times, he admitted quietly. And how many jobs have you held during that time? 4, but I'm looking for work now, Marcus added hastily. As the questioning continued, it became increasingly evident that despite Marcus's genuine love for Hope, he was ill-equipped to provide the stable, nurturing environment she needed. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Margaret found herself gripping Dr. Lawson's hand tightly, her heart aching for both Hope and the troubled man on the stand. She could see the pain in Marcus's eyes, the desperate longing to be part of his daughter's life. But she also knew, with a mother's certainty, that Hope needed the stability and love that she and Dr. Lawson could provide. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the final days of the case unfolded. Dr. Lawson and Margaret sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. They had poured their hearts and souls into this battle, fighting with every ounce of their being to keep Hope in their lives. Across the aisle, Marcus Thompson, Hope's biological father, sat with his shoulders slumped. His eyes darted between the judge and the Lawsons, a mix of hope and resignation etched on his face. Deep down, he seemed to sense that the odds were not in his favor, but a flicker of determination still burned in his eyes. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, sat at her bench, carefully reviewing the mountain of evidence before her. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she flipped through the pages, weighing each piece of information with utmost care. Dr. Lawson squeezed Margaret's hand, offering what comfort he could. They had done everything in their power to prove that they were the best parents for Hope. They had shown the court their stable home, their financial security, and most importantly, the deep love and bond they shared with their daughter. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she thought about Hope, who was waiting at home with a family friend, blissfully unaware of the life-changing decision about to be made. The thought of losing her daughter was almost too much to bear. As the judge continued her deliberations, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Everyone present could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that the decision would forever alter the course of a young girl's life. Dr. Lawson and Margaret braced themselves for the outcome, their bodies tense with anticipation. They had fought with everything they had, laying bare their hearts and souls for the court to see. Now, all they could do was wait and hope that it had been enough. The biological father, Marcus, seemed to shrink in his seat, the reality of the situation settling heavily upon him. Despite his earlier confidence, the evidence presented during the trial had made it clear that his ability to care for Hope was questionable at best. As the minutes ticked by, Dr. Lawson and Margaret held on to each other, drawing strength from their love and their shared determination to keep their family together. They had done all they could. Now, their future, and hopes, rested in the hands of the justice system. The courtroom fell silent as the judge cleared her throat, ready to deliver her verdict. Dr. Lawson and Margaret held their breath, their hands clasped tightly together, as they awaited the decision that would determine their family's future. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice firm and clear. "I have reached a decision in this custody case." She paused, her eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on the Lawsons. "The court finds in favor of Dr. James Lawson and Margaret Lawson. They will retain full custody of Hope." A collective gasp filled the room. Margaret let out a choked sob, burying her face in Dr. Lawson's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, tears of relief streaming down his face. The judge continued, her tone softening slightly. "While it's clear that Mr. Thompson, Hope's biological father, loves her deeply, his current mental and financial instability makes it impossible for him to provide the stable environment that a child needs." She turned her gaze to Marcus Thompson, who sat with his head bowed. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your desire to be part of your daughter's life. However, Hope's well-being must come first. The Lawsons have proven beyond doubt that they can offer her the love, stability, and care she needs to thrive." Dr. Lawson and Margaret clung to each other, overwhelmed with relief and joy. They had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was finally here. They would get to keep their daughter, the little girl who had brought so much light into their lives. "Hope has been with the Lawsons for 5 years," the judge went on. "They are the only parents she has ever known. Uprooting her now would cause unnecessary trauma. It is in her best interest to remain with the family that has loved and cared for her since infancy." As the judge's words sank in, Dr. Lawson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted him for months melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and love. Margaret wiped her tears, a radiant smile breaking through. "We get to keep her," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Our little girl." Dr. Lawson nodded, too choked up to speak. They had done it. Hope was theirs, officially and forever. The family they had built together was safe. As the courtroom cleared, Dr. Lawson and Margaret's joy was tempered by a new reality. The judge had granted Hope's biological father, Marcus Thompson, limited visitation rights. It was a compromise that left them with mixed emotions. "It's for the best," Dr. Lawson said softly, his arm around Margaret as they left the courthouse. "Hope deserves to know where she came from." Margaret nodded, her eyes misty. "I know, James, but it's still hard." In the days that followed, they grappled with the emotional weight of allowing Marcus into Hope's life. They spent long nights talking, trying to find the right way to approach this new chapter. "We need to be kind," Margaret said one evening as they sat on their porch swing. "Marcus made mistakes, but he loves Hope. We can't forget that." Dr. Lawson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're right. It's just, I worry about how this will affect Hope." They decided to approach the situation with compassion, knowing it was in Hope's best interest to understand her origins. They would introduce Marcus slowly, as a friend of the family at first, to ease the transition. Hope, still blissfully unaware of the full situation, began to notice subtle changes in her parents' moods. One afternoon, as she colored at the kitchen table, she looked up at Margaret with curious eyes. "Mommy, why do you and Daddy look worried sometimes?" she asked innocently. Margaret's heart clenched. She forced a smile, smoothing Hope's curly hair. "Oh, sweetie, grown-ups just have a lot to think about sometimes. But we're okay, I promise." Dr. Lawson overheard from the doorway, his chest tightening. He knew they couldn't keep the truth from Hope forever, but for now, they wanted to protect her innocence a little longer. As the first visitation date approached, tension filled the Lawson home. Margaret busied herself cleaning, while Dr. Lawson pored over medical journals, both trying to distract themselves from their anxiety. Hope, picking up on the unease, became clingy. She followed Margaret around the house, her little hand always reaching for her mother's. "Mommy, can we have a tea party?" Hope asked, her big brown eyes pleading. Margaret's face softened. Of course, sweetheart. Let's do that right now. As they sat sipping imaginary tea, Margaret watched Hope giggle and chatter, her heart swelling with love. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, their family's bond was unbreakable. The day of the first visitation arrived, and the Lawson household was filled with a nervous energy. Dr. James and Margaret had spent hours preparing Hope for this moment, carefully explaining the situation in terms a 5-year-old could understand. "Sweetie," Margaret began, kneeling to meet Hope's eyes, "do you remember how we told you that you grew in another mommy's tummy?" Hope nodded, her curls bouncing. "Yes, Mommy, and then you and Daddy found me and became my forever family." Dr. Lawson smiled gently, joining them. "That's right, Pumpkin. Well, today you're going to meet your birth father. He's the man who helped make you." Hope's brow furrowed in confusion. "But you're my daddy." "I am, sweetheart," Dr. Lawson assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always be your daddy. But this man is part of your story too, and he wants to meet you." As the doorbell rang, Margaret squeezed Hope's hand. "Remember, we'll be right here if you need us." Marcus Thompson stood on the porch, a nervous smile on his face. Dr. Lawson opened the door, greeting him with a polite nod. "Mr. Thompson, please come in." The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus entered. His eyes immediately found Hope, who was half hidden behind Margaret's legs. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret broke the silence, her voice warm despite her anxiety. "Hope, this is Mr. Thompson. He's the special friend we told you about." Hope peeked out, her big brown eyes curious but wary. "Hello," she said softly. Marcus knelt down, his eyes glistening. "Hi, Hope. It's so nice to meet you. You're even prettier than I imagined." Hope looked up at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Hope stepped forward. "Do you like to color?" she asked timidly. Marcus smiled. "I love to color. Would you like to color together?" As Hope led Marcus to her coloring table, Dr. Lawson and Margaret retreated to the kitchen, watching from a distance. Their hearts ached as they observed Hope interacting with the man who could have taken her away. "She looks so small next to him," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Lawson wrapped an arm around her. "She's doing great, Margaret, and so are we." They watched as Hope showed Marcus her favorite coloring book, explaining each picture with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Marcus listened intently, his face a mix of joy and heartbreak. As the visit progressed, the tension in the room slowly eased. Marcus was respectful, never overstepping his boundaries. He seemed genuinely grateful for the chance to know his daughter, even in this limited capacity. As the months passed, Marcus Thompson's visits became a part of Hope's life, though they remained infrequent and always under the watchful eyes of Dr. Lawson and Margaret. Each visit was a delicate dance of emotions, filled with both joy and sorrow. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Marcus arrived with a small gift, a children's book about different types of families. Hope's face lit up as she unwrapped it, her curiosity piqued by the colorful illustrations. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she exclaimed, her smile brightening the room. As Hope settled on the couch to look through the book, Marcus glanced at Dr. Lawson and Margaret with a mix of gratitude and sadness in his eyes. They nodded, acknowledging the thoughtfulness of his gift. Later that evening, after Marcus had left, Hope climbed onto Dr. Lawson's lap with the book in her hands. "Daddy, can we read this together?" Dr. Lawson smiled, pulling her close. "Of course, Pumpkin. What would you like to know?" Hope flipped through the pages, pointing at the different families illustrated. "Why are some families different from ours?" Dr. Lawson took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Well, sweetheart, families come in all shapes and sizes. Some have a mommy and a daddy like ours. Some have 2 mommies or 2 daddies. And some, like you, have extra special people in their lives." Hope's brow furrowed in thought. "Like Mr. Thompson?" "That's right." Dr. Lawson nodded, his voice gentle. "Mr. Thompson is part of your story, just like Mommy and I are. Family isn't just about who you live with or who takes care of you every day. It's about love and connection. Margaret joined them, sitting on the arm of the chair. And you, my dear, are so loved, she added, stroking Hope's curls. Hope snuggled closer to Dr. Lawson. I love you and Mommy the most, she declared. As the days went by, Hope's questions about her origins became more frequent. Dr. Lawson and Margaret always answered honestly, in age-appropriate ways, emphasizing that family was built on love rather than just biology. One day, after a particularly emotional visit from Marcus, Hope asked, "Why doesn't Mr. Thompson live with us?" Margaret knelt beside her daughter, her eyes filled with love and understanding. "Sweetie, remember how we talked about different kinds of families? Mr. Thompson is part of your family in a special way, but Daddy and I are your parents. We're the ones who take care of you every day and love you more than anything in the world." Hope nodded, seeming to process this information. "So I have a big family?" Dr. Lawson smiled, joining them. "That's right, Pumpkin. You have a very big family, with lots of people who love you, and that makes you extra special." As autumn leaves painted the world in warm hues, Marcus Thompson arrived for another visit with Hope. The air was crisp, matching the tension that always accompanied these meetings. Dr. Lawson and Margaret welcomed him with polite smiles, their eyes watchful as Hope ran to greet him. "Mr. Thompson," Hope exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. "I drew a picture for you." Marcus knelt down, his eyes misty as he accepted the colorful drawing. "It's beautiful, Hope. Thank you." As Hope chattered away about her latest adventures at school, Marcus listened intently, drinking in every word. Dr. Lawson and Margaret stood nearby, their hearts heavy with the complexity of the situation. After a while, Hope ran off to play in the yard, leaving the adults in a moment of loaded silence. Marcus turned to Dr. Lawson and Margaret, his voice thick with emotion. I need to say something," he began, his hands trembling slightly. "Watching Hope today, seeing how happy and loved she is, I know I can never give her the life you've provided." Margaret's eyes welled up with tears, and Dr. Lawson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "You're the parents she deserves. I want to thank you for that, and for your kindness in letting me be a small part of her life. It means more than you know." Dr. Lawson, deeply moved by Marcus's words, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but filled with sincerity as he spoke. "Marcus, we appreciate your honesty, and I want you to know that we'll always be open to your visits. Hope deserves to know her roots, and you're a part of that." Margaret nodded in agreement, wiping away a tear. "We're all family now in our own way," she added softly. The three adults stood there, united in their love for Hope, each understanding the unique role they played in her life. It was a moment of profound understanding and acceptance, a turning point in their complex relationship. As the seasons changed, Marcus Thompson became a more frequent visitor in Hope's life. Each day he arrived, a small gift tucked under his arm, his eyes shining with anticipation. Hope's face would light up with joy every time she saw him, her excitement palpable as she wondered what surprise he had brought this time. "Look, Hope," Marcus would say, presenting her with a new coloring book or a stuffed animal. "I thought you might like this." Hope would squeal with delight, hugging the gift close. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she'd exclaim, her smile bright enough to warm even the chilliest autumn day. Dr. Lawson and Margaret watched these interactions with a mixture of emotions. They were happy to see Hope's joy, but there was always a twinge of worry in their hearts. Still, they knew this was important for Hope's understanding of her own story. As days turned into weeks, Hope began to look forward to Marcus's visits. She'd wait by the window, her nose pressed against the glass, watching for his car to pull up. When he arrived, she'd rush to greet him, chattering away about her day at school or her latest art project. Marcus listened intently, soaking in every detail of Hope's life. He'd laugh at her jokes, praise her accomplishments, and offer words of encouragement when she talked about her struggles. Slowly, but surely, a bond was forming between them. Though Hope was still too young to fully grasp the complexities of her family situation, she enjoyed the warmth of Marcus's presence. She didn't quite understand why he visited or why he brought her gifts, but she knew she liked spending time with him. One afternoon, as Hope sat coloring with Marcus, she looked up at him with curious eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice soft and thoughtful, Why do you come to see me so much?" Marcus glanced at Dr. Lawson and Margaret, who were sitting nearby. They nodded encouragingly, trusting him to handle the question with care. "Well, Hope," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully, "I care about you very much. I want to be a part of your life and see you grow up happy and healthy." Hope seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "I like when you visit," she said simply, returning to her coloring. Dr. Lawson and Margaret exchanged a look, their eyes misty with emotion. They knew that one day, Hope would need to understand the full truth. But for now, this simple explanation was enough. Next day, the warm afternoon sun bathed the Lawsons' backyard in a golden glow. Hope, now 7 years old, giggled as she chased butterflies across the lush green grass. Her curly hair bounced with each step, her eyes sparkling with joy and innocence. From a distance, Marcus Thompson watched his biological daughter play. A bittersweet smile tugged at his lips as he marveled at how much she had grown. He sat quietly on a bench near the fence, content to observe the happiness that radiated from Hope. On the porch, Dr. James Lawson and Margaret sat side by side on the swing, their hands intertwined. They watched Hope with love and pride, their hearts full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Margaret leaned her head on James's shoulder, sighing contentedly. "Can you believe how far we've come, James?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James squeezed her hand gently. "It's been quite a ride, hasn't it?" he replied, his eyes never leaving Hope. "From that night in the park to now, sometimes it feels like a dream." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on the challenges they had faced and overcome. The fear and uncertainty of the early days, the emotional turmoil of the custody battle, and the delicate balance they now maintained with Marcus. It had all shaped their family into what it was today. "You know," Margaret said softly, "I never imagined our family would look like this, but I wouldn't change a thing." James nodded in agreement. "Hope has brought so much love into our lives. And seeing Marcus here, being a part of her life in his own way, it's more than I ever thought possible." As if on cue, Hope looked up from her play and waved excitedly at Marcus. He waved back, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. Then Hope turned to the porch, blowing kisses to James and Margaret. "Mommy, Daddy, look at the pretty butterfly I found," she called out, her voice filled with wonder and excitement. James and Margaret exchanged a loving glance before waving back at their daughter. The love that flowed between them was palpable, a testament to the strength of their bond. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, James and Margaret felt a deep sense of peace settle over them. They had weathered storms and faced uncertainties, but through it all, their love for Hope and for each other had been their guiding light. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. They knew there would be more challenges to face as Hope grew older and began to understand her unique family situation. But in this moment, watching their daughter play in the fading light of day, James and Margaret felt ready for whatever lay ahead. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Lawson, Margaret, and Hope, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.